Part 1. The largest battleship the world has ever built had 150 guns pointed at the sky. 150 guns, and not one of them could bring down the plane that flew straight down the middle of them. He came in low over the water, he climbed, he passed between the Yamato's conning tower and her smokestack close enough for the men on the bridge to read the numbers painted on his wings. He was an American, some farm boy's son, somebody's brother, and the young Japanese sailor watching from the bridge that day would carry the memory of that airplane for the rest of his life. Because he had been told a certain thing about Americans, every man in that fleet had been told it. That the Americans were soft, that they would not press an attack home. That when the steel started coming back at them, they would break and run. He watched that pilot thread the needle through a wall of fire and come out the other side. And a thing he had believed since he was a boy began to come apart in his hands. That was the 24th of October, 1944. The battle you have never quite heard. The whole story of happened the very next morning. Its name is Samar, and by every rule of arithmetic, the Americans who fought it should already have been dead. The men who flew those planes were not chasing medals. Most of their names never reached the history books, but they have earned every second of your attention. What happened off the island of Samar the following dawn should not have been a battle at all. It should have been a slaughter. A handful of slow little carriers built on merchant hulls, a thin line of destroyers. They stood in the path of the most powerful surface fleet Japan ever sent to sea. The battleship Yamato alone weighed more than all 6 of those little carriers put together. And the strangest part of the whole affair is this. When the shooting stopped, it was not the small ships that had run. It was the giants. To this day, men argue about why. Some of the answers are locked away in the mind of a Japanese admiral who took them to his grave. But part of the answer flew off the decks of those little carriers that morning with almost nothing to fight with and kept coming anyway. To understand what happened at dawn on the 25th, you have to go back 5 days. October 20th, 1044, the Gulf of Leyte in the central Philippines. General Douglas MacArthur waded ashore through knee-deep surf onto a beach he had not seen in 2.5 years. Behind him came the largest amphibious force yet assembled in the Pacific War. In front of him lay the whole of the Japanese Empire's remaining strategy. The Japanese called it Sho-Go 1. Shu meant victory. They no longer had the resources to win the war. They had enough for one last great fleet action. If they could destroy MacArthur's landing force off Leyte, they might buy their empire another year. Maybe 2. Enough time, they hoped, for the Americans to lose their nerve. They committed almost every warship they had left. 3 prongs. The southern force, coming up through Surigao Strait, would be annihilated in the last great line of battle engagement in the history of naval warfare, and it does not concern us today. A northern force, under Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, aged 58, would sail down from Japan with the last carriers of the once mighty Kido Butai. They had almost no aircraft left to fly from them. They existed for one purpose: to be seen, to be chased, to draw the American battle fleet away from the beachhead. And then the center force, the main punch. 4 battleships including Yamato and her sister Musashi, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, 11 destroyers, 200,000 tons of steel and gunpowder under the command of Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, aged 55, a naval officer of 35 years service. His job was to circle north around the Philippines, thread the San Bernardino Strait, and come down on the American landing ships from above. He would not sleep 3 nights running. The trouble started before he ever reached the strait. October 23rd dawn, 6:32 in the morning. The Palawan Passage submarines lying in wait, USS Starter and USS Stace. The submarines let the Japanese column pass into range and then opened fire. 6 torpedoes hit the heavy cruiser Atago. Atago was Kurita's flagship. She rolled over and sank in 18 minutes. Another spread of torpedoes finished the heavy cruiser Maya, 4 ships back in the same column. A 4th cruiser Takeo was crippled and had to turn for home. In one dark hour before Kurita had fired a single shot at his enemy, he had lost 3 heavy cruisers and his own ship. He went into the water himself, an admiral of the Imperial Japanese Navy, swimming in his uniform, waiting to be picked up by a destroyer of his own screen. When they hauled him aboard the destroyer Kishinami, soaked through and running a fever, one of the officers offered him a place to rest. He did not rest. They transferred him to the Yamato at midday. He walked onto the bridge of the largest battleship on Earth wearing borrowed dry clothes and carrying the weight of what he had already lost. And the worst of the road was still ahead of him. October 24th, the Sibuyan Sea. This is the day the young sailor on the bridge of the Yamato would remember for the rest of his life. American carrier planes came in from Halsey's 3rd Fleet, waves of them hour after hour. The Japanese gunners threw up everything they had, colored bursts to mark their own shells, tracer, a ceiling of steel that any man on the bridge would have said was impossible to fly through. the Americans flew through it. They came down out of the sun and out of the smoke and out of the clouds, and they kept coming even after their squadron mates were burning in the water behind them. This was the lesson the Japanese fleet carried into Samar the next morning. Not that the American pilots were skilled. They knew that. Not that the American pilots were brave. They knew that too. The lesson was that the Americans did not stop coming. By late afternoon, the planes had found the Musashi, sister ship to the Yamato, 68,000 tons, one of the two greatest battleships Japan had ever built. Her designers had believed she could not be sunk by aircraft. The American pilots put roughly 17 bombs and 19 torpedoes into her over the course of the day. Some of that was more than she needed. She listed, her bow went under, her stern lifted, and in the last light of the afternoon, the impossible ship rolled over and slid down into the Sibuyan Sea, taking more than 1,000 men with her. A silence settled over the bridge of the Yamato as the men watched her go. We had thought these ships could not be sunk. That was what the young Japanese sailor remembered decades later. He had watched the impossible happen. He had watched the American pilots do it. That evening, Kurita turned his surviving fleet around and steamed back the way he had come. To an American reconnaissance pilot looking down through the clouds, it looked like he was giving up. That was the message that went up the chain of command. Kurita was retreating. He was not retreating. He turned around again as soon as the light was gone. Under cover of darkness, he brought his fleet back on its original heading and made for the San Bernardino Strait. Threading 4 battleships and their screen through a narrow strait at night in wartime without lights is a feat of pure seamanship. He brought it off. His ships came out the far side of the strait a little after midnight on the 25th, formed up in the open Philippine Sea, and turned south along the coast of Samar. He expected to find the American battle fleet waiting for him in the dark. He found nothing. The American battleships that should have been guarding that door were 300 miles to the north. Because Admiral William F. Halsey, aged 62, commander of the United States Third Fleet, one of the most aggressive and celebrated combat officers America has ever put to sea, had taken the bait. Ozawa's carriers had been sighted the previous afternoon. Halsey had turned his entire fleet north to run them down. Every fast battleship, every fleet carrier, every cruiser in his surface action group, he had ordered them all north to finish off what looked like the last carrier force of the Imperial Japanese Navy. He had not left a picket at the strait. He had not told Kinkaid, commanding the 7th Fleet down at Leyte, that the strait was undefended. Kinkaid believed a task force under Vice Admiral Willis Lee was still guarding the door. There was no such force. There was nothing at all between Kurita's 4 battleships and the American landing beaches. Nothing except 3 groups of small escort carriers doing quiet work along the coast, whose crews were making breakfast in the dark before dawn and had no idea an entire Japanese battle fleet had just come through the strait to their north. The northernmost of those 3 groups had a call sign painted on nobody's chart but their own. Taffy 3, 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, 4 destroyer escorts, 12,000 men. Their commander was a rear admiral named Clifton A.F. Sprague, age 48, called Ziggy by everyone in the Navy who knew him. He had been a naval aviator since 1921. He had a wife and 2 daughters back in California. He did not know what was coming. None of them did. The sun would be up in a little over an hour, part 2. Dawn came up grey over the Philippine Sea on October 25th, 1944. The men of Taffy 3 were doing the ordinary work of an ordinary morning. The escort carriers were built on merchant hulls, slow, thin-skinned. The sailors joked bitterly that their ship classification, CVE, stood for combustible, vulnerable, expendable. 6 of them steamed in a loose formation off the coast of Samar. Fanshawe Bay, the flagship, Callinan Bay, Kitkun Bay, White Plains, St. Lo, Gambier Bay. None of them displaced more than 8,000 tons. Around them steamed the screen 3 USS Hull, USS Heermann, USS Johnston, commanded by Commander Ernest E. Evans, aged 36, part Cherokee and part Creek, a graduate of the Naval Academy class of 1931. 4 destroyer escorts, smaller still, USS Samuel B. Roberts, USS Dennis, USS John C. Butler, USS Raymond. The plan for the day was to hunt submarines and to fly ground support for the soldiers pushing inland across Leyte. The planes on the flight decks were loaded for that plan. Depth charges for submarines, small fragmentation bombs for troops and trucks on a beach, 50 caliber machine gun ammunition. Nothing on those wing racks was designed to punch through the armored deck of a battleship. Nobody had thought they would need it. At 6:37 in the morning, an ensign named William C. Brooks was flying a routine anti-submarine patrol in a TBM Avenger off the escort carrier St. Lo. He was looking down through a gap in the clouds when he saw ships. He looked closer, he counted the pagoda masts, he counted the flat quarterdecks, and the great grey shapes behind destroyers. He counted battleships, He got on the radio, back on Fanshawe Bay. Rear Admiral Sprague heard the transmission and did not believe it. Nobody could believe it. The most powerful surface fleet in the Imperial Japanese Navy could not possibly be 20 miles off the port bow of an escort carrier group whose largest guns were 5-inch mounts on the destroyers. Sprague asked Brooks to check again. Ensign Brooks checked again. Then he did the only thing a young pilot in his position could do. He rolled his little airplane onto its back and dove on the lead Japanese cruiser. The only weapon on his wings was 2 depth charges. Depth charges were barrels of explosive designed to sink submarines. They were built to detonate underwater at a preset depth. Dropped on a surface warship, they would do almost nothing. A man in a wooden rowboat throwing rocks at a moving stone wall. Brooks dropped them anyway. That single act, in the first 3 minutes of the morning, is the whole story of the day in miniature. The right man, the wrong weapon, diving in regardless. He could not have known, pulling out of that dive, that the shape of the next few hours was already set. That the men of Taffy 3 would fight this battle not with the weapons they wished for, but with the ones already bolted to their planes when the enemy came over the horizon. And that somehow it would be almost enough. At 6:58 in the morning, Yamato opened fire. Her main battery. 9 guns, 18.8, 1 inches across the muzzle, the largest naval rifles ever mounted on a warship. Each shell weighed just over 3,000 pounds, roughly the weight of a Volkswagen. Each shell could travel 25 miles. This was the first time in the Second World War that those guns had ever fired at a surface target. The shells came down around Gambier Bay in tall geysers of colored water. The Japanese put dye in their shells, a different color for each ship, so that gunnery officers on the bridge could correct their aim. Coral, yellow, green, purple. A Gambier Bay air crewman on the flight deck, waiting for his Avenger to be loaded, saw the colored splashes rise around his ship and said something a shipmate remembered for the rest of his life. They are shooting at us in Technicolor, coral, lemon lime. On the bridge of the Yamato, Vice Admiral Kurita saw the flat shapes coming out of the mist and made a mistake he would live with for the rest of his life. He thought he had found the American fleet carriers. He thought the destroyers were cruisers. He believed, at that moment, that he was engaging the main strike arm of the American Pacific Fleet. The decisive battle the entire Imperial Japanese Navy had spent 40 years training for was finally happening, and it was happening in front of him. He gave the signal for general attack. His captains scattered to run down the fleeing prey. The tight, disciplined formation that had come through the strait at midnight came apart in the excitement. His own chief of staff would admit after the war that no heed was taken of order. The most powerful fleet in the Pacific went into the fight, tripping over its own feet. And meanwhile, back on Gambier Bay, in an officer's wardroom, a man named Edward J. Huxtable Jr. was finishing his coffee. Lieutenant Commander Regular Navy, commanding officer of Composite Squadron 10, VC-10, torpedo, bomber pilot, career aviator. He had flown TBM Avengers off this carrier since April. The general quarters klaxon started to sound. A moment later, a young officer named John Holland, a lieutenant junior grade, came through the wardroom door at a dead run. Captain, you had better get up to the ready room in a hurry. They are already manning planes. Huxtable followed Holland out into the passageway. He asked what was happening. He got most of an answer before he reached the flight deck. His Avenger was already on the catapult. He climbed in. He had no torpedo. The ship was out of torpedoes for the morning's mission. He had no armor-piercing bombs. Those had never been loaded because nobody had expected to fight a battleship at breakfast. What he had was 100 rounds of 50 caliber machine gun ammunition for the turret gunner behind him. 100 rounds against Yamato. He went up anyway. He climbed his Avenger through the anti-aircraft fire until he was above the Japanese column. From up there, he could see the whole shape of what was happening. Kurita's cruisers were pulling ahead of the battleships. The heavy cruiser Haguro was closing on the rearmost American carrier. The destroyers of Taffy 3 were turning to charge into the fight. The whole battle was a running gun duel spread across 30 miles of open sea, and every minute it lasted, the Japanese closed it. Huxtable did the math in the cockpit. He had nothing to drop on Haguro, but Haguro did not know that. He pushed the nose over and dove on the lead cruiser from ahead. His bomb bay doors were open. To the men on Haguro's bridge, an American torpedo bomber diving at them with its bay open meant one thing, a torpedo run. They put the helm over hard. The cruiser heeled into a violent, evasive turn. Her main battery could not fire while she was turning. Her range on the American carriers opened 30 seconds. A minute. Huxtable pulled up. He came back around and dove on Haguro again from the starboard bow. Bay open. The cruiser heeled the other way. Another 30 seconds, another minute, another 800 meters between Gambier Bay and the shell that would kill her. He did that for 2 hours. 2 hours in an unarmed airplane over the largest guns in the Imperial Japanese Navy, pretending, feinting, threatening a weapon he did not have. Every dive a lie the Japanese captains could not afford to call. And meanwhile, down on the surface, Commander Evans took the USS Johnston into the fight. USS Johnston was a Fletcher-class destroyer, 2,000 tons, 5.5-inch guns, 10 torpedoes. Her top speed was 36 knots. Evans laid a smokescreen for the carriers, then turned into the Japanese line and charged. He put a torpedo into the heavy cruiser Kumano. It blew the bow off her. She fell out of formation, dead in the water, on fire. Johnston kept coming. She engaged the battleship Congo at 18,000 yards with her 5-inch guns. It was like a man throwing baseballs at a locomotive. It did not matter. Every splash off Congo's superstructure was one shell. She was firing back at Johnston instead of at the carriers behind her. Then Congo hit Johnston with a 14-inch shell. The blast knocked Evans off his feet on his own bridge. The blast tore into his left hand and shredded his shirt. When his officers looked up, he was standing again, bleeding, giving orders in the voice they had always known. He fought Johnston for another 2 hours. By the end, she was surrounded by 4 Japanese destroyers and a light cruiser firing back at all of them with the guns she had left. When the order to abandon ship finally came, Evans was still on the bridge. He was last seen giving the wheel commands himself because there was no one left to give them to. He did not survive. He was 36 years old. He received the Medal of Honor posthumously. At the same time, on the destroyer escort USS Samuel B. Roberts, Lieutenant Commander Robert W. Copeland, aged 34, a naval reservist, had given his crew a speech before the fight that men would remember to the end of their lives. This will be a fight against overwhelming odds from which survival cannot be expected. We will do what damage we can. Samuel B. Roberts came within 4,000 yards of the heavy cruiser Chikuma. She fired her 3-inch and 5-inch guns as fast as her crews could load. She hit Chikuma repeatedly and disabled her number 3 turret, a destroyer escort, 1,200 tons, silencing a main battery turret on a 9,000-ton heavy cruiser. Then Congo found her. A 14-inch shell tore through her engine rooms. Steam scalded men to death where they stood. She lost power. She went dead in the water. The Japanese battleships kept firing. She sank with 89 men still aboard. Copeland survived. And up above in the sky over all of it, the American planes kept coming. They came in 1s and 2s. There was no time to form up. Deck crews on the escort carriers were flinging planes into the air with whatever ordnance was on the racks that morning. Some Avengers had 250-pound general-purpose bombs meant for infantry positions, some had depth charges, some had nothing but their turret guns. The pilots went in anyway. The bombs bounced off armored decks. The machine guns could not touch armor plate, but every plane that dove forced a Japanese warship to break its firing solution. Every dive brought the little carriers another few hundred yards. And when the bombs were gone, and the depth charges were gone, and the 50 caliber ammunition was gone, the pilots did something that has been written about for 80 years and never quite explained. They kept diving. An empty Wildcat is a lightweight fighter with no ordnance and no rounds in the guns. It cannot hurt anything. It cannot kill anything. It is a machine made of aluminum and gasoline. But when it comes down out of the sun at a cruiser, the men on that cruiser cannot know it is empty. They see an American fighter in a dive. They put the helm over. One Wildcat pilot flew 20 strafing runs that morning, 10 of them without ammunition. Another pilot, out of everything else, opened his cockpit canopy in a slow pass alongside a Japanese cruiser and emptied his .38 caliber service revolver at the ship out of the cockpit. A pistol against a warship. This appears in the official Taffy 3 combat reports. The Japanese captain took evasive action. At 8:57 in the morning, the Japanese finally caught Gambier Bay. Captain Walter V.R. Viewage, her skipper, had been dodging shell splashes for over half an hour. He had turned into every salvo, guessed the Japanese firing pattern, and outthought the range clocks on 4 Japanese warships. But the range was down to 10,000 yards now. There was nowhere left to turn. Chikuma hit her below the waterline. Her engine room flooded. Her speed fell off. She began to list. More hits came. From Chikuma, from Haguro, from Yamato herself, whose main battery had finally found the range. The escort carrier began to burn. At 9:07 in the morning, Gambier Bay rolled onto her port side and went down. She is the only American aircraft carrier ever sunk by naval gunfire. 900 men had been aboard. 131 did not come out. The survivors went into the water in oil-slicked life jackets and clung to whatever floated. And as they clung, the great grey hull of the Yamato steamed past them, close enough for the men in the water to look up at the largest warship the world had ever seen. Some of them, according to Japanese accounts recorded after the war, raised their arms out of the sea and waved. 3 Vice Admiral Kurita stood on the bridge of the Yamato and could not settle his mind. The battle was 3 hours old. 3 of his heavy cruisers were sinking or sunk. Chokai, hit by dive bomber attacks and finished by her own scuttling. Chikuma, torn open by aircraft and by the guns of Samuel B. Robert. Suzuya, burning, her forward torpedo tubes cooking off, dead in the water. His formation was scattered across 30 miles of ocean. His captains were chasing their own kills. American planes were still coming down on him from every direction he looked. He could not count them. He could not tell whose carriers they were coming from. Some of them were coming from Taffy, 230 miles south. Some of them were coming from the airstrip at Tacloban that the American army had barely finished clawing out of the mud on Leyte 4 days earlier. Some of them were his own targets from Taffy 3. To a man on the Yamato's bridge, staring up through the smoke, they all looked like the same air group. They looked like Essex-class fleet carriers. He had already lost his flagship 72 hours without sleep. He had watched the Musashi go down. His communications were fragmentary. He had received a radio report of an American fleet north of him, closing to cut off his retreat. No such fleet existed, but he did not know that. At 9:11 in the morning, 25 miles from the American beachhead at Leyte, Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita gave the order to break off the engagement, turn north, regroup. The center force came about. The most powerful surface fleet in the Pacific turned away from a group of escort carriers. It had been within 20 minutes of destroying and steamed north, back toward the strait it had come out of 6 hours before. The men on the flight deck of Fanshawe Bay could not believe what they were seeing. A signalman is supposed to have said, out loud, on the radio circuit, "Suk," in words that were probably not the exact words, but might as well have been. God damn it, they're getting away. They were getting away. Kurita would take his surviving ships back through the San Bernardino Strait that night. He would return them to Brunei and eventually to Japan. He would live out the rest of the war ashore. He would live 33 more years. He would speak, occasionally in short statements, in interviews with Japanese naval historians, about the decision he made that morning off Samar. One of the things he said more than once was this: "I did not want to sacrifice my young men in a hopeless fight." He never explained more than that. He died on December 19th, 1977, at the age of 88. The rest of the answer he took with him. A Japanese officer, interviewed by an American interpreter after the war and quoted in James D. Hornfisher's History of the Battle, said something else that is worth holding on to. The bombers and the torpedo planes were very aggressive and skillful, and the coordination was impressive, even compared to our own standards, but there had been no coordination. The American pilots had not been given a single unified order all morning. They had launched 1 and 2 at a time off 6 different escort carriers with whatever ordnance the deck crews could hang under their wings. They had come in from every angle because they had never had time to form up. What looked like the disciplined, coordinated strike of 4 fleet carriers was 150 tired young men flying their airplanes as fast as they could turn them around. Some of them landed at Tacloban on the beachhead the army had just taken, where the airstrip was still under Japanese sniper fire. They refueled with the fuel that was on the ground. They took whatever bombs the army could give them, if any, and they flew back out over the fleet and did it again. At 10:50 in the morning, as Kurita's fleet was already turning away to the north, a new sound came down out of the clouds over Taffy 3. 9 Japanese airplanes, they did not release bombs. They dove. The Japanese Navy had committed itself that morning to a new tactic: bodies as ordnance, airplanes as manned missiles. The unit that came down on Taffy 3 was called Shikishima. It was led by a young lieutenant named Yukio Seki. It had taken off before dawn from an airfield at Mabalacat on Luzon, 180 miles to the west. This was the first organized kamikaze attack in the history of the Second World War. Lieutenant Seki flew his Zero directly into the flight deck of the escort carrier USS St. Lo. The same St. Lo whose patrol plane 4 hours earlier had spotted the Japanese fleet at first light, Ensign Brooks's ship. The ship that had launched the very first American response of the entire morning. Seki's bomb went off in her hangar deck. The fires reached her fuel and her stored ordnance. She began to explode from inside. In half an hour, she was gone. More than 100 of her men went with her. 2 more kamikazes struck the escort carrier Kalinin Bay. She lived. By some grace of the way her fires ran, she lived. The airmen who had spent the morning attacking battleships with empty guns now took off again to fight the pilots who had come to die. When the last Japanese plane was gone, the men of Taffy 3 were still standing on scorched decks, streaked black, holding fire hoses that had run dry. They had lost 2 escort carriers, Gambier Bay and St. Lo. They had lost the destroyers Hull and Johnston. They had lost the destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts. They had lost more than 1,000 men killed. Many of the wounded and the men from the sunken ships had been in the water for hours. Some of them would remain in the water for 2 more days before the Navy realized where they were and came to look for them. Not all of them were still alive when the search parties arrived. Sharks had come. The Navy would remember that failure. 9 months later, it's in July of 1945, when the cruiser Indianapolis went down in the Philippine Sea, the memory of what had happened off Samar would still not be enough to save her crew from the same fate. But Taffy 3 had done what they were asked to do. Kurita's fleet never reached the American landing ships in Leyte Gulf. The transports never took the shelling they had been sent out to receive. The soldiers on the beach, tens of thousands of them, kept moving inland and never knew how close it had come. Lieutenant Commander Huxtable landed at Tacloban somewhere after 11 in the morning. He had been in the air for 3 hours. He asked for bombs. The ground crew told him there were not enough to spare. The airfield had been taken from the Japanese only 4 days before. There was not yet a proper ordnance dump. He was recommended not to fly again that day. He flew again that day. He continued to fly missions off improvised airfields for the rest of the Leyte campaign. His squadron, C-10, would keep operating out of the beachhead until it could be transferred to another carrier. Huxtable's would stay in the Navy after the war. He would retire as a captain. He died in 9,998. His Avenger, on the morning of October 25th, 1,944, had killed nothing. It had drawn fire from 3 heavy cruisers for 2 hours. That was enough. Yamato steamed back through the San Bernardino Strait that night. She would live 6 more months. On April 7th, 1,945, on a one-way sortie to Okinawa, with only enough fuel to reach the invasion beaches and no plan to come back, she was found by American carrier aircraft in the East China Sea. Roughly 380 planes attacked her over the course of 2 hours. Torpedo bombers came in low, dive bombers came in high. She fired her 18-inch main battery at aircraft, the last time in history any battleship would ever do so. It did not save her. She rolled over and blew up at 2:23 in the afternoon. 3,055 of her crew went down with her. 280 survived. Somewhere in the water among them, or maybe not, was the young sailor who had stood on her bridge on the 24th of October, 1,944, and watched an American airplane thread the needle between the conning tower and the smokestack. He had been told those men were soft. He had been told they would not press an attack home. He had watched them fly into his guns. He had watched them charge his fleet in destroyers a fraction of his size. He had watched them, from the deck of the Yamato itself, sunk and burning and clinging to wreckage, lift their arms out of the oil and wave. The word he had been taught to use about them fell out of his vocabulary that morning. He would carry a piece of shrapnel under his skin for the rest of his life as a souvenir of those days. He would carry something else too. A memory of what he had seen men do when their bombs were gone and their machine guns were empty and their carriers were on fire behind them. The weapon that never ran out that morning was never in the bomb bay. It was in the men. These were somebody's sons. In a few short years, many of them would be somebody's fathers. In a few years more, somebody's grandfathers, the quiet men at the end of the table who did not much like to about the war. Men who once flew empty airplanes at battleships because the alternative was to leave their friends to die and they could not bring themselves to do it. You may have known one of them, a man who fixed cars or preached on Sundays or ran a hardware store on Main Street. Man who once, when he was very young, dove on a Japanese cruiser with 2 depth charges because he could not think of a single thing else to do. They did not tell those stories easily. A great many of them never told them at all. If your father or your grandfather wore the uniform in the Pacific, or a few years later in the cold hills of Korea, then you are the keeper of a story like this one. And those stories are slipping away from us a little more with every year that passes. Tell it while you still can. Leave it in the comments below, if you have one to tell. A name, a ship, a place, whatever you have. Because the men off Samar proved something on that grey morning in 1944 that is worth holding on to. Courage is not the weapon in your hands. It is the decision to attack when your hands are empty.